For those of you who don't know me, my name's John Winchell. I live in Eden, New York, which is just a little bit south of Buffalo, New York. There is virtually no snow on the ground at the moment, only in a few little spots, but definitely seems like spring is starting to come around. And that makes a good time to kind of talk about certain things that we can look at that maybe we can reset. And like I said, like you see on the slide here, it says turn over a new leaf. This is kind of a situation where you can change certain things, Mother Nature allowing, and get things going a little bit. So the title is Little Things, Big Impact, but it's basically just talking about certain things that I noticed when I was down in Tennessee and certain things that we can do to, general things we can kind of do to improve on as we go along. And this could be a 4-hour talk, so I will try to make it as quick as I can. And if you do have questions, you can see my email down below there. You could call me. My phone number is right there. I'm able to come out to farms when all this stuff seems to settle down, and we'll see how things go from there. But so kind of going along that vein of a clean slate and a fresh start, and kind of looking at the different geographies. And after spending some time a week down in Tennessee here last month, I got a chance to see some good dairies and got to talk to a lot of good producers. So with some of the things that I'd like to talk about, here's some things that I kind of noticed in Tennessee on some dairy opportunities. Obviously, forage quality is important, not just in Tennessee, but in every state and in every country all around the world. And these other ones are also all very heavily, also very important. Harvest management, bunker management, and inventory, they actually all go together. We know we need to have forage quality. If you look at the legs of a chair and you've got 4 legs on a chair, if you're not meeting one of these criteria, that chair is not going to stand very well. So, within forage quality, harvest management sure affects forage quality, and then of course bunker management is related to all of that. And of course, if we don't have inventory, we start to run into issues. So let's talk a little bit about forage quality to start with, kind of part of my corn silage analytics module that I've been working on for a while. So obviously we know it's all about forage quality, and I look at forage quality and bunk management as what I would call the last great dairy efficiency. I know a lot of the dairy farms that we work with, they have people coming in all the time, and the word of the day is try to become more efficient, more efficient, more efficient. But when you look around at the dairy, I think, and see a lot of different bunkers, and you see a lot of forage quality samples, definitely this is something that almost everyone can improve on, and every year gives us a new wrinkle into that. So looking at forage by the numbers, when you look at Tennessee, you see a large percentage of the diet is going to be corn silage, and we're going to have some small grain silage, some hay and haylage. And then we've got some of our products that are purchased that come in, whether it's Western hay or byproducts. Those are byproducts, especially our forage. But when you run into a situation where you have a little bit of a lack of inventory, those byproducts come in very handy. And actually, there's a lot of diets that are run very successfully in the South and in Florida and out in California utilizing byproducts, as long as you have enough effective fiber. But we do know that purchasing any kind of products, whether it's Western hay or any of the byproducts, that definitely will cut in on your income over feed cost a little bit as well. And these are more expensive, and they do reduce our bottom line. So the idea is to try to maximize the forage quality and quantity that we can have. And one thing I'd like to remind you of, we should probably know the answer to most of these questions. And this one, the first one that the first cow is telling us is, what percent forage is my diet? What is my income over feed costs? And I know if we talk with Jeffrey Bewley about this, there's a lot of other things that we can look at. And then what are my pounds of components? I know in New York here, a lot of the herds are looking at pounds of components to make sure that they kind of have a good idea. And that is a number that I've heard more nutritionists and more consultants and dairymen actually talk about. When you ask how are things going on the farm, they actually talk about pounds of components, when 5 to 10 years ago, they would have told you how they were milking or what their fat or protein was. But it's interesting to see how people are starting to look at that pounds of components a little bit more. But when you look at corn silage, I don't care where you're at in the country, corn silage, especially here in the Northeast, corn silage is the Super Bowl winner. It's the king. It is the largest percentage of forage that we have in our diet. One of the biggest issues that we run into is we cannot control the weather. Corn, in comparison to other crops, is pretty stable and pretty forgiving, but yet there are certain times when we get weather at the wrong times that will really affect either the digestibility of that corn silage or the starch levels of the corn silage, or actually both. And a lot of times the weather can really control what kind of yield we have. So we definitely cannot control the weather. That's one of the biggest chinks in the armor to looking at corn silage. And like I said, I equate corn silage and corn silage harvest. So I want to stress that as corn silage harvest as kind of the farm's dairy Super Bowl. It's because it is the largest output or input that we have on the dairy, and we need to make sure we're maximizing the inventory and the quality that we can with that. So we know that we can't control the weather, but we can control things like day length. We can control planting population to make sure that our population is planted correctly so we don't further stress out the plant. We have enough stress with Mother Nature as it is. We don't need to help increase that stress with population issues. Harvesting at dry matter, to me, the single most important thing that we can do with corn silage, just because, and we will talk about it in a minute, there's so many reasons why. Corn silage processing score is right up there with dry matter. We want to make sure we're processing that corn silage and maximizing the starch potential that we are. We are not here to feed turkeys, we're here to feed cows, so we definitely want to make sure that our processing score is up to par. Packing density, it goes along with that. We want to make sure if we spend all that time and spend those months growing that crop, that we want to make sure that it's packed and we don't lose dry matter loss and quality loss. So getting the packing density up and doing the best we can. Varieties, Joe Lohr from University of Wisconsin, he says that is the single most important thing that he believes is the varieties and the plant genetics help dictate how that crop is, whether it's successful or not. You look at Joe Lawrence from Cornell, there's a article coming out in either Progressive Dairyman or the Progressive Forage that's coming out, I think this month, that talks about how weather really, really has a large impact no matter the variety of the corn. So it's interesting. I think both of those are very, very important in what we look at. Finally, agronomic inputs are very important because obviously the nutrition of the plant is very important. We need to make sure that we're putting enough manure on. We make sure that we're doing the right things, whether it's soil testing or putting enough nitrogen, or on certain areas using fungicides. We want to make sure that we're giving that crop the best opportunity it can to succeed. And with that in mind, talking about corn a little bit, some of us older folks, like I'm 49 right now, but I remember as a youth, I always found a jar of Prego in the drawer in the cupboard, and the tagline that we used to remember on TV is it's in there. But if you look at corn is kind of a TMR in a plant. You have so many different qualities with corn silage that really, really help with energy density on that dairy. And when you look at 50 to 75% of that forage in the ration is going to be attributed to corn silage, it does make it king of forages. I know alfalfa likes to claim their place in forages, but really when you look at the energy density and the digestibility of corn silage, it's really hard to beat. Plus, it's one cutting primarily, unless you're in a couple different parts of the country, but it's one cutting compared to multiple cuttings. So we're definitely going to get starch, we're going to get some plant moisture, we're going to get NDF, we're going to get some protein thrown in there. Then you look on the digestibility side, you're going to get all the pools of digestibility that you need to reach. And then also starch digestibility is part of that process as well. And for the beef guys out there, definitely we still look at TDN on the beef side. But with seed corn selection, there's a lot of things that go into seed corn. And I remember when I've done nutrition for about 25 years now, and about 15 years ago, I decided that it was probably a good idea that I get involved in crops and working with the dairymen and my producers on seed corn selection, because when you're working as a nutritionist, and I'll talk on that side of the fence, it's really hard to outfeed poor forages. So it's very difficult and very expensive. And that is one of the things that we need to really pay attention to. So with seed corn selection, agronomic package, yield potential, starch potential, making sure our relative maturity, our day length days are correct and our population is correct. And then we start to look at what are we trying to choose, whether we're looking at a conventional hybrid, whether we're looking at just your standard hybrids that have some trading to it. And there's obviously the floweries out there, and then there's brown midrib out there as well. One thing I would say, if you're going to be planting corn for corn silage, I know many people use dual purpose varieties and some people use grain varieties for their corn silage. I would suggest that we look and lean more towards silage corn varieties for silage, as opposed to using grain varieties, just because of how they're built. They're built for a certain reason. We know that when we're trying to get corn to black layer and dry down, we want to have that corn stand up and not lodge or fall over. So obviously there's going to be more lignin in a lot of these full grain corns than there is in some of these silage hybrids and silage varieties. One thing that's very important is don't outkick your coverage. I've noticed that in New York, Ohio, 2 months ago in Kentucky, last month in Tennessee, that we're trying to get our days at maximum to try to achieve maximum yield. And I think we might be leaving some things on the table on our corn silage end. So when I say don't outkick your coverage, make sure you're not planting too long of a relative maturity for the ground that you have. Or if we have a really wet year, make sure that you are taking those days and sometimes having to short up some of these corn varieties a little bit, because we want to make sure we're managing that growing season correctly. And then plant population is the other thing I've already mentioned. Make sure your plant population matches the bag. If you look at the directions on a box, when you're cooking something, you want to make sure you follow directions on the box. Make sure when you look at populations that you follow the populations that are suggested, because there are plenty of situations where I've seen, for example, BMR or some of these leafy varieties, or even some of these other real flexy varieties that are kind of racehorse varieties from any company that you can think of. When you overcrowd them, you will stress them and you will lower digestibility and open up that plant to mycotoxins and other stresses. So planting population and relative maturity are very important. So we've all seen this movie, and if you build it, they will come. So it's kind of one thing that I want to make sure we talk about a little bit as we try to do our best with harvesting our crops. We want to make sure that we are doing the basic things that we need to do. We want to make sure that we're rotating our crops. We want to make sure that we're testing our soil to make sure we're feeding our soil temperature, or feeding the soil right. We're planting at the correct temperature and not too early. And we'll talk about some ways to look at that. Make sure everybody says they got a guy, but make sure you got a good guy. And I can't stress enough the importance of crop advisors and crop consultants on the farm to make sure that they work as part of that on-farm team, because it definitely will help. The one thing I don't like to see a lot of times is there are certain seed providers that then you find them everywhere, that come in, sell the seed, and you don't see them again till the following August when they're ready to make the order again. Whether you're a seed consultant or a certified crop advisor, you need to make sure you're doing what you can to help us fight off some potential issues. And when I was looking for these pictures, I looked at crop guy online instead of crop consultant, and my wife was there with me, and I don't suggest you just Google crop guy on Google, because it definitely isn't exactly what I was looking for. So to kind of talk about corn silage for Tennessee only, And this is corn silage comparisons from 2016 to 2020 in the dry matters where they are in the correct way. And I looked at just a few parameters that are really important to me, whether it's dry matter, NDF, NDF-D30, UNDF 240, starch, and 7-hour starch, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. The blue line is 2016 to 2019. The orange line is the BMR corn silage from 2016 to 19. The gray line is this growing season's corn silage from 2019 to 2020. And then the same on that gold line is the BMR for 19 and 20. So I have circled right here, you can look at dry matters, and you look at the 33, 32, 34, 32. They're really pretty consistent. The goal, though, and we'll talk about why in a couple minutes, the goal is to make sure we have that harvest dry matter between 35 and 36% dry matter. And with a processor, and if we're processed right, sometimes guys will even sneak up into that 36 to 38 range. But it's really important to make sure that we get the dry matter at the right time and we harvest the whole plant dry matter when we need to. When we look at NDF, NDF is pretty similar among varieties. So when you look, they look pretty similar, not much differences. But then when you start looking at NDF D30, that's when we start seeing differences between the corn silage. We've known that for years. You could have the same NDF, but there could be 15 points difference in NDF digestibility, even though the NDF has the same exact number, depending on the variety, depending on the growing season. So it's really important to make sure that we're looking at what our NDF D30 is to kind of show the digestibility. When you look at the UNDF 40, when I look at these, UNDF 40 is a basic indicator of what you're spreading in the field or what you're putting in the cows are putting in the gutter. Some nutritionists that are on, obviously we look at trying to control the UNDF 240 and control the rate of passage of the diet. So one thing I've noticed is UNDF 240 is a lot more climate sensitive or season sensitive than what NDF D30 is. Some work that Cornell did at a single dry matter point, there was a 10 to 15% difference in UNDF 240. So that's one thing we need to make sure, and as the industry grows and as we start to learn more about how to make great forages and how to window good forages, that UNDF 240 is pretty important. So when I go back and look at starch and you look at dry matter all the way to the left, see how close those numbers are to each other? That is where I think in Tennessee we can really, really make a difference in yield as well as forage quality, because I feel that, when you look at the averages, when you're looking at the average dry matter for conventional corn silage from 16 to 19 is 33.8, and the starch is 33. In my estimation, we're blowing a lot of that feed value and a lot of that corn back into the field, or it's leaching out, because remember, after 32%, roughly 32% dry matter, that's when you start to see corn dent. And the more the corn dents and the harder the kernels get, the more starch that's deposited, the more weight that's added to the corn. And with 50 to 60% of the plant being ear, we want to make sure we maximize the ear. And that's why dry matter harvest is so important. So we want to work on raising these two things if we can. And it can be done. It for sure can be done. Every 2 days is roughly 1% starch after dent. So that's really important. And it becomes a kind of a scary game of chicken sometimes when you're looking at the weather and or the custom harvester is coming in that window. So it's good to make sure, and it's good to plan. If you know you're the first guy that the custom harvester sees, then maybe you want to plant your corn a little bit lower in day length so that you can be that first guy that's done and kind of match that harvest window a little bit better. This was some work that I worked with Rick, and this is, and with Carmichael's. This is a Ag Central Co-op's corn hybrid plot that they had for 2019. This is NDFD and starch. So the really two big things that we look at in corn silage. And really when you look at the NDF digestibility and the starch levels in this plot in particular, they were all very good numbers. And I was was really happy to see high starch levels, because I was concerned that everything I'd been seeing previously is lower starch. Now I know that some situations this is the best ground, the best 5 acres in that area for sure, and we know that that area also gets a good whack of manure, and it was maintained with some nitrogen and I believe fungicide as well. So it was given the best opportunities to succeed. And I know that, you know, we're going to have various areas, whether you're on the plateau of Tennessee or different parts of Tennessee, northern Tennessee, where your growing conditions aren't as well. But it is interesting to see that when this plot, when you look at it, how much it maximized starch and actually starch digestibility for this plot averaged 59, and the average starch digestibility or NDF digestibility has been 54 or 55. So there is the potential to do it. We just need to unlock the reasons why we aren't quite getting where we need to be with that. But this is a pretty good example of what we're seeing. And you can definitely see some things sticking out. And I'm not going to talk about certain varieties are better than other varieties, because working with enough plots, I have learned that that is not the case, that there's a lot of situations where there's 3 or 4 varieties that are going to be ones to look at. And sometimes when we look at the numbers, the LSD is really low on them. So they're not really significantly different or statistically different. They're close, but you know, a lot of people want to pick out what they look to as a winner. This is that part of that same corn plot. This is tons per acre and starch. The tons per acre is going to be on the right, and the starch is going to be on the left. And really, when you look, they don't necessarily match up. So that's one thing that I really want to stress. It's pretty important to see how plant stress and the varieties that we're planting and see how that impacts it. We look at milk per ton and milk per acre. This quadrant chart is what most of the industry has been using for years to kind of look at their corn silage and the quality of their corn silage. The top right is usually the high yielding varieties that don't have as much digestibility or quality. The bottom right, or the bottom left the top left is going to be high yielding. The bottom left is going to be lower yielding and not as digestible or not as good a quality. But remember, these numbers are all very close together. So there is not a huge significant difference between the ones that are up into this top left quadrant, which is you're getting your tonnage and you're getting your milk per ton and your milk per acre. So you're getting yield and quality in this top left box. In the bottom left box, when you look at that, that is going to be where you get a lot of high milk per ton and maybe don't have quite the tonnage. And there are certain varieties and there are certain silage varieties that feed really great, but yet are a little bit lower yielding, but have a lot more milk per ton potential. And actually milk per ton is kind of starting to go away a little bit because of some of the iterations that are in milk per ton and the way it is figured. It can really have an issue when you have a real dry corn silage. That milk per ton number will falsely go down. And so a lot of people are starting to go away and look at other options with milk per ton. If you look at this, the variety in that top right corner all the way to the right, that variety was made at a really good dry matter, at 35% dry matter, had high digestibility and high starch. And the other ones, we had some custom harvesting issue, and the plot was made a little bit late. The actual plot averaged 42% dry matter, so a little further along than we like to see. But it's interesting to see how that works. I look at starch, NDFD divided by NDF, UNDF 240. It's called room and fill, a room and fill ratio that I use this a lot because you take starch plus NDFD, you divide by 240, it takes that dry matter bias out that milk per ton puts in. And when you look at this plot, this hybrid chart, which is that RFC times dry matter, you can definitely see the quadrants. So when I look at that and know that this plot was chopped a little bit drier, I wanted to see the true value with that bias taken out. So you can start to see different varieties that stick out by looking at both RFC and milk per ton. When you look at haelages and small grains, typically 25 to 50% of the forage. Here's the list down here, whether it's baleage, haylage, dry hay, small grains, rye, triticale, wheatlage, a lot of these summer products, BMR sorghum, some of these brachiotic dwarf sorghums that you're starting to see now, some Sudan grass, millet. There are definite benefits to some of these products in your planting rotation. And with haylage, I won't stick too much time on this either. This is looking at haylage and small grain comparisons, but you can definitely see on crude protein, which is the second part in, the the crude protein is 20%. So you're definitely on your alfalfas. You're definitely going to get protein. But then when you keep going on, looking at ADF and NDF, and especially NDFD that's circled in green, there's a huge difference in digestibility. And you can tell the triticale silage, the wheat silage, and the rye silage, they are more digestible because I think they fit Tennessee a little bit better because they grow in a more moderate time during the year. They don't have to worry about that heavy rain in the spring, and they don't have to worry about when the water gets turned off in the middle of the early June, I should say. And when you have less water stress and less plant stress and less heat stress in a more moderate climate, you're going to get better digestibility on your feeds. So it's interesting that we have to really make sure we're monitoring that as well. I've told some guys that have some rilage out there and some wheatlage and some triticale this year as it's starting to grow, to make sure that maybe 10, 15 days before they think it's going to be ready, to probably have your nutritionist take a sample out of the field just to see where the protein is, just to see where the digestibility is in that plant, because sometimes that can help us figure out if, oh boy, we should go now, or we can have some time to wait just a little bit. And if you guys have questions about that, once you get those samples back, do it. But I would say looking at that is really important until we get the growing degree day part figured out for that. With corn silage, we've talked a lot about this, but a lot of people still use the milk line to check and see when they're supposed, if they feel that this is the opportune time to plant or to harvest that corn silage. That's starting to go away. We want to, as new varieties come out, we have some stay green varieties. We have some varieties where the ears dry down a lot quicker than what the plant does. So there's going to be a mismatch between whole plant dry matter and milk line. So we need to make sure we're checking whole plant dry matter, and I feel that's really important. So to me, when the whole idea of looking at milk line is we're really starting to go away from that. I mean, I look at the ears when I'm doing whole plant dry matters, but I just look at them to kind of use for a reference. This is a product called U2U. It is, and the website is above that. This is a corn growing degree day tool that I know I've talked with some nutritionists, and we're definitely looking at it. It looks at the growing degree days for the spring and the summer, and it shows if you can actually put in the day length of your corn, it'll give you the approximate silking date. It'll give you the black layer. And the way I start to look at it is I take this number and I figure out by looking at a certain amount of growing degree days. Typically at silking, you add 800 growing degree days to silking, and that's going to get you to about 31 to 32% dry matter corn silage that is starting to dent. So I don't use this tool completely for harvest, but what I do is it gets me into the ballpark. It makes so I can actually use whole plant dry matter and chip the samples, so that we know when we should be starting to look at it, so it kind of gives us a good idea what's going on. But like I said, I've said it probably 4 or 5 times, correct dry matter harvest is vital. I do a lot of chipping with corns in New York, and I used it in Ohio when I drove around. I always had a chipper in the back of my truck in the fall, and I really utilized it quite a bit, because with corn silage will sit at 22 to 25, 26 dry matter for quite a long time. as the starch starts to develop and as the ears start to dent, or the kernels start to dent a little bit more and the ears start to form, after 28% dry matter, corn typically dries down if it is not stressed at about 0.5% a day. So what I do is I use the growing degree day tool, that U2U, to figure out when we're going to be in that ballpark around 28% dry matter. That's when I start chipping fields, whether it's looking at chipping your earliest field, your latest field, and to kind of get a representation of when we need to do it. And I also have some farms that sequence it. So it's really easy to do. You just run it through the chipper shredder. I run it through the chipper end first and then the shredder end to make sure it looks to be a uniform size. And then I either use a Koster tester, a dehydrator to check on the dry matter. This is kind of the sample predictions that I've done. Actually, I did this year here in the Northeast. This is kind of some of the things that I do. When you look at how you're checking the dry matters, there's plenty of resources out on the internet that you can find, whether it's using an air fryer, a microwave, the new NAR machines, a dehydrator, or a Koster tester. There's plenty of ways, and I know a lot of dairies already have something on the farm to check their dry matters as it is. If you don't, you should definitely have one, but this is a way to look at that. The NIR4 farm I've been using a lot to check dry matters on corn silages and to check starch levels on corn silages as dry matter increases. And I did a lot of work. I did 250 samples for different customers all through Western and Central New York to kind of help them sequence to make their corn silage right. So when we talk about yield, everybody wants to plant 118 to 120 day corn to max out their yield. As the relative maturity of each hybrid increases by 5 days in length, silage adjusted to 35% or 35% dry matter, in every 5% days in length increases tons, about 0.5 ton to the acre. So every 5 days up is a 0.5 ton to the acre, there is some tonnage there for sure. But I would like to suggest that if you look at this chart right here, as NDF drops and as ADF drops and as plant dry matter across the bottom increases, you see what happens with starch. Starch drives that plant to dry down. As that plant starts to get into its final reproductive stage, that is very important part of this equation to make sure we hit that level when we can maximize starch and maximize dry matter so that we can get the best plant that we can. So if you look at this, this is some information from Joe Lawrence with Cornell Corn Silage Hybrid Trials in 2018. Don't worry about the dates, just worry about kind of the percentages. On September 12th, you were looking at whole plant dry matter, you were looking at starch, and then yield. And as you see, 7 days from when that first, on September 19th, 7 days from when we first looked at it, see how much difference you see increase. You see a 15% increase on whole plant dry matter. We saw a 13% increase on yield, and we saw a 14% increase in starch, and that was in 1 week's period. So when I said it's a game, kind of a poker game, you want to make sure that you're hitting that window as good as you can to maximize that, because planting long day will get you height and will get you a lot of fiber, but we want to make sure we're getting energy density out of it, and that's where we need to hit the window with corn silage. Processed versus unprocessed corn silage. Obviously, if you don't have a corn silage processor, you're going to want to process your corn, or you're going to want to chop your corn silage at that 30 to 33, 34 dry matter to make sure that we're utilizing that starch the best we can without having a processor. For those that have a processor, you want to make sure you're doing things to make sure we got that corn processed down as good as you can. This kind of is something that I do for some farms where I track the growing degree days, and then I look at the chipping. When I look at the chipping and check the dry matters at harvest, I have the plot up, the graph up top, and then I also look at the chipping information, and then I match that and actually predict when we're supposed to chop by looking at the weather forecast so we can have a good idea where we're going. Place for high chop, I know with inventory being an issue, It can be a difficult situation, but in different areas, we are looking at high chopping corn to get a little bit more digestibility and a little more starch value and leaving some of that lignin in the field. Obviously, if we have carryover issues, that's something that you really don't want to do. When you look at the eye chart here, obviously, which one do we've all been to the eye doctor and they ask us which one looks better, one or number two, or one or number two. So obviously in this case, one is better than number two. Two is a lot blurrier. So when I look at corn silage processing, we want to look at, is it number one or number two? Make sure that when you're chopping your corn and when you're in your Super Bowl and you're playing in your Super Bowl and the kickoff has already started and you're starting to harvest that corn silage, when the guy is going through, make sure you look at those kernels and make sure we're processing, because if we don't, we are losing ourselves a lot of milk. That's why I look at floating corn silage as pretty important. We can talk a little bit more about that at another time. You can only float fresh corn silage, but you just fill up a container with water and you take out the stalk as that will float and the kernels will sink, and then you look at the kernels and evaluate, and you want to make sure that you only have at most one whole kernel, but preferably all your kernels should be at least quartered. And then you're chopping your silage and you're processing your silage right. And that will change by field as dry matter changes in the field. So if you're chopping really wet stuff that is a little longer day, or it was on sod that didn't dry down as well, or it was heavily manured, that's going to have an opportunity to stay greener, then you might want to open up the processor. But if you've got corn that's starting to get away from you, you want to tighten that processor down. One thing we know about corn silage, if you ask any nutritionist, they know, and we all know this as well, fresh corn silage doesn't feed as well. And there's various reasons of that, whether it's a soluble protein of the starch that's in that, or soluble protein that's in that corn silage, or the starch digestibility. We know that those things increase as the time goes. And by the time Thanksgiving to Christmas comes around, we know that silage is starting to feed better. So with the issue in Tennessee of having low carryover and low inventories, I suggest we really start doing a lot more work on finding the varieties that consistently have the starch that's available early at the harvest. Mother Nature has something to do with that, but when you look at this graph to the left, you can see all these different dots and the different rates of 7 hour, this is 4 hour starch. Look at the differences between the 4 hour starch. You want to make sure we're looking at the starch, especially if we're short on feed. We want to make sure we're looking at varieties that are going to be available to feed as quick as we possibly can, knowing the carryover situation in Tennessee. And usually after 4 to 8 weeks, everything all kind of balances out. But when we're tight on inventory and we have no carryover, it's very important to look at the varieties and do some more research to make sure that works right. This is from a dairy that I worked with in Kentucky. When you look at corn silage processing score, you look at fecal starch as nutritionists. I know a lot of nutritionists are starting to look at fecal starch because, like I said earlier, we don't want to feed the turkeys. So we want to make sure we kick through our manure and make sure that our manure is in good shape. This is a part of a fecal starch on-farm troubleshooting audit that I do on farms. This one farm in particular was losing at a fecal starch about 4%, which means we were losing quite a bit of, or actually 5%. We were losing 4 pounds of milk with the fecal starch showing what it was. And we can do some work with this. I can work with your nutritionist. I can work with the farm on looking at these fecal starches as well, because it'll just give you an idea if we're down 4 or 5 pounds of milk. A lot of times this will tell you why we're down in milk. And it's important when we look at that. Finally, when we start going to the end of the things here, we look at bunkers. This is a example of a beautifully maintained bunker, something that we always try to achieve. We want to make sure that bunker and silage management, and we want to know what our loss is, and we want to minimize the loss that we have, whether we're utilizing bags or bunkers. And there are certain situations on certain farms that maybe if you're 100 to 200 cows, maybe a bag might be better than trying to manage a bunker. But it depends on on what pad that you have and the situation that you have on farm and how well you're doing with packing and managing your bunker. So from bunk to bunk, obviously forage quality and bunker quality and bunk management is really important. We don't want all of our bunks to look like this. We want to make sure we're doing the best that we can to achieve that bunker density and forage quality. And 1 out of every 5 to 7 ton harvested is lost to dry matter or quality from secondary fermentation. So when you think of 1 out of every 5 to 7 ton, that's quite a bit, especially if we're just running out of corn silage a month before we're chopping. It's really important to make sure our bunker density is right. So when you look at bunker density numbers, obviously the more bunker density we have, the less dry matter loss that we have on the farm. So this is kind of that same chart that I do. This as part of a bunker audit that I've done here in Tennessee, Kentucky and other states. When you're in this ratio of being under 15 tons of dry matter loss, you are below where you need to be. The average for the United States is roughly around 14 to 16 bunker density pounds of dry matter, and the goal is to be up in this area, in this green area. You want to be above 18 on your bunker density, and we need to work however we can to try to get that number up, because when you get to that percentage, that's when you're getting down to that 12 to 10% loss that we're going to run into. And you want to make sure, I've seen bunkers at 25 to 30% loss. And when you're looking at losing a quarter to a third of your bunk and you run out of feed every year, that doesn't really help. So doing everything that we can to maximize our bunker density is very important to do. This is some Tennessee farms that really some good dairies that I worked with versus the average bunker density, and looking at the goals. When you look through the middle, you obviously want to be in that 18 to 20 range, and the herds that I'd worked with were actually probably in the decent range. All of them were above average, the average bunker density number, but definitely there's room to improve on dry matter loss there. But you know, the numbers aren't bad. When I was in a couple other states, I've seen the bunker density average be under. So when you also look at part of packing and part of bunker quality, you want to make sure you're using plastic, and I really like what I've seen in oxygen barriers, and then making sure we do a good job covering the tires and covering the bunk, and making sure that we're keeping that bunker covered down as well as we can. Oxygen barrier, this is actually a herd that I worked with in central to eastern New York. The picture to the left is the oxygen barrier he's using. The picture to the right, and you can see his hand down there at the bottom right of that screen. That is actually the bunker density, or not bunker density, but that is what the silage looks like under that oxygen barrier when they had tires cover to cover, an 18 plus bunker density, and they did a really nice job how they packed. They didn't bread loaf the bunk. They kept it pretty close to where the bunker walls are going to be. And Bolson from Kansas State, you can see the quote down here: the film reduces losses in the outer 2 to 3 feet of silage by up to 40 to 50%. And with as much as 16%, 18% of silage in the U.S., there's a huge premium on protecting it. And I agree with that. If you don't use an oxygen barrier, I think it really causes some extra mold and some potential mycotoxin issues, and then taking off and scooping off some of that silage that we could be feeding to the cows. And then make sure we're using enough tires to cover that, to make sure that we're keeping that like we should. One thing that we always see, you know, the whole idea is we try to get the corn silage into the bunker as quick as we can. And as we do that, we want to make sure that we're not running into problems. We want to make sure, my question is, on this bunk, do you think we have enough bunker pressure on this bunk? Do you think we have enough tractor weight? In the picture to the left or the picture to the right. When you look at both of those, I would question, you know, if we have enough, especially on some farms that have small fields and multiple trucks coming in at the same time. So these are my critical 5 steps. make sure your harvest silage dry matter is correct. Make sure your length of cut is right. Make sure you have enough weight on the bunker. I can't stress enough how much weight on the bunker is important. When you have a bladed tractor, because of the way it pushes things down, you want to make sure that you have another tractor on as well, because when you take the weight of a bladed tractor, you divide that by 2 because of the pressure of the blade. So you want to make sure, even though you think you have enough weight on that pile, you want to make sure that you do actually have that. Layer thickness is really important when you don't want to get buried by multiple trucks coming in. You want to make sure you're using that 6 inches or 5 inches of layer thickness so you don't get too much oxygen in between those layers. And then tons delivered to the pile. You want to make sure when we're harvesting silage and this is the Super Bowl time of the year, we want to make sure we have our quarterback lined up and situated and taken care of for what I think a 4-year contract. But you want to make sure you have a quarterback at the bunk so they can tell that harvester to slow down a little bit so we don't get behind. I know that's almost an impossible question to ask a dairyman when they're trying to bring feed in, but this is definitely the most important thing you can do. And you can surely see from farms that I see that are very profitable, there's still a difference between haves and have-nots on farm. And a lot of times I see that in bunker density and forage quality. That is the biggest separator between a lot of these farms. So obviously proper harvesting, we reduce the pH, we reduce the oxygen out. Just think of it as one of these food wrap things that we use, and then also making sure our silage is the most stable we can. If you have the bunker density where it needs to be, it will be as stable as it can be. Following these different rules of thumb, there's several rules of thumb out there that people use for how much weight they have to have on the bunker. This chart here to the bottom looks at tractor weight, but depending on the amount of acres per day and the tons that you're bringing in. When you look over to the pictures to the right, whether you have these sheep's foot that people use, and I see that work pretty successfully in different areas. People can use those. Obviously, they're on the construction side, but people can rent those and use those, and I think that they work. They work pretty well. One thing to notice: see how this tractor packing up against the wall to the left. See how they have a single tire on the right side and a double tire on the left side. That's getting closer to the wall so that you can make sure you're packing on that wall, because that's one of the biggest chinks in the armor I see in bunkers is the sidewall. Another issue we look at feed out. We're doing a pretty good job on defacing, but there are times when we deface down and then we chunk out the bottom. And when you chunk out the bottom, this is taken with an infrared camera, how much heating and how much secondary fermentation we're having by chunking out that bottom. So I would suggest when we're defacing to deface all the way to the ground if we can, and pull that out a little bit so that we can get all of that out without having to either chunk it out or take a skid loader bucket to it, because we're definitely going to create some secondary fermentation there. This is along the lines of basically some of the bunk density guidelines. I can get you some of these cards that kind of explain that. You can have it in the tractor with you. Looking at different facing equipment, I think if you're doing a good job facing, whether it's a bucket, whether it's a shaver, whether it's a rake, I've seen a lot of problems with a bucket, but I've seen some people that have used a bucket and did a whale of a job on their bunker, but they have to be very particular and be very slow with it. So make sure your facing equipment is doing what it should be. Storage loss potential, obviously don't bread loaf your bunks. I know I see a lot of really tall bunkers out there. It's very dangerous, number one. Number two, we can't get those real high bunks or real high piles packed as well as we should. And then make sure we have a nice facing and a clean bunk, and make sure that everything's good with that. Just talks just a little bit more about what the infrared camera's seeing. This is some on-farm support work that Alltech is doing on a bunker density worksheet for your individual farm's bunker densities. When I get asked about inoculants, if you're going to make all your silages at 35% dry matter perfect every single time, every single ton, every single field, then, you know, that's the only time I would suggest to somebody that, oh, well, I don't think you'd need an inoculant. But we all know in the real world, all of the silage comes in at different areas from different fields. There's a hodgepodge, so make sure you're utilizing your inoculant. Looking at fermentation levels, you can do a fermentation audit as well, because it's important to see, you can pull out farms that have not inoculated versus farms that have inoculated, looking at some very specific parts of the fermentation profile in the silage. So this is something that we can work on with you as well. And I think this is a really important part to look at that most people don't look at. To kind of finish up real quick, make sure as we're getting into that spring, we're looking at the growing degree days. And I do a lot of work with growing degree days on haylages, first cutting haylages and hays. And now I'm starting to work with small grain silages to kind of figure this out. A lot of people in the Northeast here, it shouldn't be different down in Tennessee. We're using dandelions kind of as a predictor of when we should be harvesting our early silages in the spring, because when you look at the growing degree days of dandelions, they match up to early grasses really, really well. And we know about early grasses time, or a little bit earlier than that, is when we should be making our small grains from the fall. So it's really important to start looking at that. And yes, I would stress as we finish up, without rain, nothing grows. Learn to embrace the storms of your life. There are certain things that we can do where we can use the weather at our advantage by looking at maybe reducing the day length on the corn, so that if we know we get a big drought every year starting in, or the water gets turned off starting in, you know, June 1st every year, or June 15th or July 1st, we know that we might want to, maybe if we back off on the corn date a little, even 5 to 10 days, we will move that harvest window around just a little bit and move that silking window around a little bit, and we might get some more starch by backing off on the day lengths on the harvesting side as well as the growing season. And with that, I'd like to thank University of Tennessee and Liz, and I wish I could be here in person to answer questions and see farms and do things, but this is what we're dealing with right now. So I really appreciate it, Liz. Thank you.
No, definitely, John. Thank you for taking the time to be here virtually with us. I do have a couple of stupid questions before I open it up for everybody else. So with bunker density, you probably said it and I probably missed it, but how do you measure that on your own farm?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did not put anything in there, and I probably should. What we do is I have a really big drill, and I will take different places in the bunker. I will make sure that the bunker is flat, and I will take a core that you can buy at Dairy One sells a master, I think it's a master forage probe that you can take, and you can just take a strong drill, and I just drill into the bunk, and I have a tape measure that I actually take and check out the depth of that core that I pulled, and then I look at the dry matter, and then I measure. There's a few different charts that you can use to measure bunker density that way.
Okay, so would that be the same type of tool that I would use if I was doing a core sample on like a bale of hay? I'd use the same tool?
I use it on the same, but really I don't suggest it, because the core is, I think, 1.5 inches, so it's a lot bigger around than what your typical hay probe is going to be. So I really, a hay probe's just not going to work compared to some of these larger probes.
Interesting. Another stupid follow-up question, how much weight do I really need on my bunk? I know you and I talked about it the other day, but I wanted to make sure I remembered.
Well, when you're looking at that, I believe that it's 800 pounds per ton per hour. And that's how much of based upon how much silage is coming into the bunker. So I probably should have broken that down and put a chart together that kind of showed a nice example of that. But you want at least to have 800 pounds per ton per hour.
Thank you. All right, listeners, if anybody has any questions, please unmute and ask John or throw them in the chat. or we'll all just sit here quietly and stare at the screen.
Do you have any other follow-up questions as well? Not to put pressure on you.
Thanks, John.
Of course.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, with brown midrib corn,
Yep.
I know you mentioned population, making sure you don't like stress the plant by overseeding, but I know it's very susceptible to like weather problems and stuff because of the lignin. Could you explain some like recommendations you have in general for that? Like, should you consider where you plant it, for example, in relation to winds or anything like that, or what your feedback is on that?
Yeah, I've worked with, as a nutritionist and both selling seed, I've worked with BMR quite a bit over the years. I know that there's, been, some comments made that, we can't grow BMR in certain areas. And there's definite plant stress differences between BMR and conventional silage. But really, any silage company or any seed company you work with, they're going to have those racehorse varieties. They might not have the same digestibility and the same change in lignin because of that mutation, the genetic mutation, but you're going to see varieties like that. But to answer your question, what I like to see is BMR does not like to be crowded. So if you look at most every BMR, you need to have that population down, in my opinion, from 28 to 32,000. Maybe the newer varieties, the most modern generation, maybe to 34. But what I see a lot is I see a lot of times that BMR is crowded from being at 34 to 36 to even 38,000 population. And when you crowd that, it being a real flexi ear and a flexi plant, you will actually have smaller stalks and smaller ears because of that fact of crowding it. You're also going to open up your susceptibility to lodging and the plant going over by actually crowding it, because the more you crowd it, the smaller the stalks are. And when you have smaller stalks and lower lignin, you can run into that opportunity. So you want to make sure you keep the population down where you in that 28 to 32. Even if guys will say, oh, you can stretch it to 34 and you'll be fine, I still would suggest 32 just because I want to have a little bit of a wiggle room in there as well. And obviously the other parts is when you look at plant stress, BMR does stress a little bit and is more blight susceptible than other varieties, even though the newer generations are a little bit better. And then I would always, if you can, not plant BMR on corn situations. You want to plant it on sod. You want to make sure that it's fed right and potentially use a fungicide. Now, I think that fungicide use on BMRs is pretty important, and I think it does help reduce that stress. But you could have a field that's really low-lying field that normally gets foggy when the other fields don't, and that field needs fungicide as well, because you need to make sure you're protecting that plant from those multiple issues of stress. So with BMR, I would stress population. I would stress it's good to put it on sod or first or second year corn ground. Make sure you don't outkick your coverage on planting dates and planting maturity. If someone tells you that, well, I know there's a little bit of a yield drag with BMR, which is typically that 2 to 3 ton to the acre, when you see that yield drag and you have a salesman that'll say, oh, you just want to plant a 10-day longer variety of BMR, that's great. You might pick up a little tonnage on the yield end from the longer day, but you're actually, if you're going to chop it at the same time anyways, you're actually losing because you're not letting that starch maximize. So make sure you plant that BMR in the window that your ground is giving you, because if you go too far on the yield side, you're going to be in trouble.
Thanks, John. The Carmichael Dairy has raised their hand, and I assume that means they have a question.
Of course.
Can you hear me?
Oh
Yes,
my
sir.
gosh, can I hear you?
Yeah, that's good. Hey, when you're talking about inoculant on either spring or corn, what type of bacteria are you looking at to best suit either spring crops or corn?
With spring crops, I like to see the front end producers, the lactobacillus type of inoculant on the spring crops, just because, you know, we want to make sure we're maximizing the amount of sugar and the amount of substrate we can. And sometimes we can have real cloudy springs, especially when you guys are making your crops in the spring. We'll definitely want to have a front end lactobacillus type of inoculant. For corn silage, depending on the size of your bunker and the feed out that you have. I know we all want to feed out at 12 inches a day, but there's a lot of big bunks out there. And if we know we're not getting across that face and we're not taking at least 8 inches off that bunker face every day, that I would look at using a Buchneri inoculant if you can. Also, depending on how you're chopping that silage at the moisture or the dry matter you're chopping your silage is important to see as well. But if you're going to be on that drier side, trying to maximize your starch, 36, 35, 36, 37, I would say definitely use a Buchneri inoculant. Because if you use a Buchneri inoculant when you're chopping at 28 to 32 to 33% dry matter, if you're making it on the wet side, you're going to have some acetic acid accumulation in that corn silage, the kind that you smell that smells like vinegar on some of those wet silages. With acetic acid, you're not going to see a lot of mold or secondary fermentation. So I would suggest that you use Buchneri on corn silage, and then use the regular front end lactobacillus on the small grains.
Any more questions for John? I swear I really am going to get that Jeopardy theme song on repeat, people, and just play it.
They're letting me off easy.
I know.
No, that was a great question that Matt had, because, that one thing I hear that over and over, especially with the milk economy the way it is and the way the milk price is, people always say, well, is there a way we can just cut stuff out or cut out an inoculant? And I've just seen too many issues when, things get away from you and you don't use an inoculant and you kind of hurt yourself both ways.
All righty. Well, while I finish up, it's everybody's last chance to raise their hand or holler. Oh, Carmichael's. Yes, you raised your hand again. Go for it.
Okay, so we're looking back to the inoculant question on the pile density. If you're looking at an 18 density with you showed on your chart like a 13% loss, are you changing that loss if you keep the density the same with an inoculant? And what loss is that?
I would say, there's not been much, I don't know if I've ever seen any research on it, but I still feel that depending on the size of the face of the bunk and how you're feeding it out, I think you can really save yourself some tonnage and dry matter loss by using a Buchneri on that. Even though your bunker density is good, the farms that I see that seem to have the least amount of loss are using an oxygen barrier inoculant and packing it as tight as they can. I would say, if I stand out on a limb, I think you're still going to save another 1% to 2% depending on how big your feed out space is and how much you're taking off that bunk face.
All righty. Well, if you had any burning questions here you didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to email me and I will pass them along to John. If John and Elizabeth are also okay with it, I will share his contact information with our Tennessee Dairy Discuss listserv and our agents across the state in case any of y'all have any questions you'd like to ask him directly.